Hello and welcome back to Thursday Thoughts as we continue our look at the life of Daniel, the impact that he's had not only in his generation but in all the centuries since then. When we finished our time together last week, we were at the end of chapter 6 where we saw that Daniel was prospering under the reign of Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian. We watched him go into and come out of a lion's den unscathed because of his God's protection. And so today we begin a major shift as we move into chapters 7 and 8. In fact, when I begin reading that chapter, immediately those of you that have been paying attention to some things are going to go, wait, what happened? Because we're going to see that we find Belshazzar mentioned in chapter 7 and verse 1, and he's been overturned and out of power, replaced by the Medes and Persians. So let's establish some criteria as we complete the second half of this book. In the first half, we had an introductory chapter, then we went into court life. You basically have 6 instances of court life, the intrigue, the things that happened, the subterfuge, the plots that went on, and the way Daniel and his friends always came out victorious because of their character and their allegiance to their God, their faithfulness. So that was loosely in chronological order. Now, we know that between chapters, there were as many as 20 years time lapse at times, but certainly the events were basically in order as they would occur. You can forget that totally as we begin chapter 7. We're going to go back probably maybe 15 years or so. You might recall that Daniel was mid-80s when he was in the lion's den. Now he's about 70 years old, and we've gone backwards, and Belshazzar is still on the throne. What happens is, in the second half of this book, we are going to look at the man, his visions, the way God used him in prophecy. So this chronological account of what happened in the court life is pretty much gone. So there's a very clear and distinct and important break as we begin chapter 7. So let's do that by reading the first 8 verses of Daniel chapter 7, beginning verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched until its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. And after this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. It had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Let me stop here just for a moment and make some things pretty clear. All right, now, we're going to see that this chapter, to some degree, parallels the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2, or the dream. Clearly, his was a dream. But there are some differences. Do you remember when we studied chapter 2 and I told you that Nebuchadnezzar saw these Gentile kingdoms the way the world might see them, in glitter and glory and power and pomp. But when we begin this section of Daniel's writings, we're going to see the Gentile kingdoms of this world the way God sees them. Not only that, bear in mind, a very strong portion of this is going to reflect the impact these kingdoms have on the Jews. So again, some kingdoms that have risen in points and time over the earth are not really an issue here because of their lack of direct impact on the Holy Land, particularly the city of Jerusalem. So we see that again here. Now, if we follow the good rules of scriptural interpretation, though some things are going to be confusing in chapters 7 and 8, we're going to allow the word to interpret itself to the degree that that is possible. Now, when we see beginning in verse 3, Daniel sees 4 kingdoms clearly in his vision. And notice in some versions it says visions and dreams, and it's almost like they're used interchangeably in this particular chapter. Now, God's not trying to confuse us here. He's not trying to contradict what Nebuchadnezzar has seen. He is adding clarity. He's adding the impact that is about to occur for the Jews as we move through. Now, notice, we begin with what we know is a look at Babylon. Reminding you again, Babylon has already fallen at the end of chapter 6, but we've moved back in time. Notice how Babylon is described here as a lion. A lion is a very powerful creature. So this lion represents Babylon in all of its power and its glory. Notice it has wings, wings that are bird-like. Those wings are plucked, removed. Now, no doubt, the strength of Babylon, the fierceness with which it attacked its enemies is represented here. Even the speed that it conquered, represented by the wings. When we see those plucked, we have to look at 2 possible suggestions here. That the kingdom of Babylon, by the time Daniel has this vision, is not gone, but is waning in its strength and its power because the Medes and Persians are already nipping at its heels. And then there is the fact that Nebuchadnezzar himself was going to go into that 7-year period when he was basically out of his mind and living like an animal. And I need to remind you, if you go back and reread that description of that period of time, Nebuchadnezzar's body changed, and it's almost like he got feathers. Do you remember that? And so here, these wings that we see, to me, are almost suggestive of what was going to happen to him. And then, at one point, he was going to, after 7 years, finally acknowledge that he really wasn't all he had attributed himself to be and credited himself for. In fact, he acknowledged that it's the God of heaven who is sovereign and who is in control. Now, you might say, why did God use a lion in this vision that Daniel had? If you're aware at all, at one point, lions were used to represent Babylon, and lions stood almost symbolically guard as you would enter into Babylon. And there are in the museums of the world today still some lions that are either replicas or restored versions of those lions. So there's no doubt that it was applicable and accurate for this lion to represent Babylon. Okay, now in verse 5, we shift very quickly. Notice the transitions are abrupt. There's not a huge amount of time devoted, but a significant amount of detail for each of these kingdoms as they are represented by these beasts. Now, the second beast is like a bear. Notice the bear kind of pushes itself up on one side, suggesting a weakness on the other side, or maybe a wound or something that would make it less strong. Clearly, now remember what I said, the Medes came on the scene first. But the Persians, once they entered and basically dominated the Medes, though there was a loose alliance between them, definitely Persia was the power and the strength. And this bear has 3 ribs in its mouth. Now, scripture is totally silent about those ribs in terms of clearly defining them. But because of what we know from scripture, and now with the added information that we receive from history, we know that those ribs are probably the kingdoms that were allies against this mighty kingdom that we saw. And so that would be Lydia, Babylonia, and Egypt. So no doubt those ribs represent the 3 kingdoms that allied themselves to fight against Medo-Persia. Now, we do see that a bear is strong. A bear is not as fast. So I've talked about this before in previous studies. If you've ever been in one of my classes, the Medo-Persian armies were huge, but they weren't lightning fast. You didn't move the vast numbers of troops that they had in a short amount of time. So this bear is actually very representative and would have been appropriate as a symbol for the Medo-Persian kingdoms and the way they function. Beginning in verse 6, we saw another beast, and this beast was a leopard. Now, this leopard had 4 wings, and it also had some kind of like 4 heads, which would be different. Now, we know leopards are fast. You might know that basically in about 13 years, once Philip of Macedon told his son, you need to go find a kingdom that is fitting for you. Macedonia is way too little for you. It's just not enough. Go make a kingdom that suits you. So in about 13 years, Alexander the Great conquered the known world. And so in a lightning fast manner, he never lost a battle. That blows my mind, because most kingdoms of the world, they may lose a skirmish without losing the war, but he never lost a battle. Now, it's fitting that there's a fast animal. These 4 wings probably refer to the fact that when he died, a little bit of discrepancy. Most sources say at 32, a few say at 33. When he died, his kingdom was divided into 4 completely different sections, and generals that had worked under him basically took over control of those kingdoms. That's interesting too, because for a little while it became unclear whether this prophecy would be totally fulfilled as it is written, because after Alexander the Great died, he actually had a son that was born to him posthumously, and some people wanted the kingdom preserved and that son made ruler, but it didn't happen. Again, so much plotting and conniving that went on at that particular time, and that we know even in the political realm and in some kingdoms of the world today, that is still the case. So, okay, he dies, the kingdom is divided. Now, you might recall that Cassander, one of the generals, took Macedon and Greece. Lysimachus took Thrace and Bithynia. Ptolemy took Egypt, and Seleucus took Syria. And that's important, because we're going to hear about a Seleucid later on that traces back, and that's significant. Now, in verse 7, we see beast number 4. The interesting thing to me is that it's called a beast, but there is no analogy with a modern animal. It doesn't say like a lion, like a bear, like a leopard, like a turtle, or like an elephant. There is no direct animal reference, though clearly God is using characteristics in the animal kingdom to send specific signals, and that's not an isolated idea in Scripture. That happens on numerous occasions. But here we see a beast who is terrible, a beast that is great and is very powerful. There's a reference to iron. There's a reference to the metallic aspect. There's this idea of it stamping out everything else that has preceded it. So that's very important, and I get it. But what is missing is some of the detail that we have seen in reference to these other animals. Now, we know, we've clearly established, these are Gentile kingdoms that have a sunrise and a sunset because God is sovereign. Remember what our primary message throughout this entire book is. So he raises and he elevates. So we know these are kingdoms that are all rising at some point and going to be put down at some point. Here you have some specific information that is a little bit, it's different, but yet it's not. We know that Nebuchadnezzar's vision, there was this image of the legs of iron, and then there were feet and toes of iron mixed with clay. You remember our talking about that? As we look in the content of chapter 7 and also the vision in chapter 8, it's almost like the legs and the feet and toes are going to be blended more into a single consideration instead of a separate consideration. So though we know there's an aspect of Rome here, it's a little bit broader and it takes on a little bit different concept. Did you notice in verse 7, it said it was different from all the beasts that were before it? And then it said it had 10 horns. And the minute we get that information added, we're not talking about history anymore. We've moved into the realm of prophecy that has not yet been fulfilled. But as I've said so many times before, all the rest has been fulfilled. There is no reason to even consider that the rest of what Scripture predicts is not going to happen. God said it, and it will take place. So you've got this image of these 10 horns, and Daniel looking at, considering, thinking about these horns, and then seeing that there's a little horn that comes up in the middle of those, and this little horn has a strong impact because it basically plucks up 3 of the original 10 horns that Daniel saw. And then we're told that this horn that has eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking pompous words. Now, let's make this clear. That is a reference to the Antichrist. Now, the word Antichrist, if you go back to the original language, anti doesn't have to mean against. It can, and it does, but it can also mean instead of. So what we have here is a clear reference to the man who's going to rise to power instead of Jesus Christ, who's going to claim that he is worthy of worship, who's going to set himself up in that sphere. And we already know the kind of person he is. Now notice we don't get a lot about him personally here, other than he speaks pompous words and he's got these eyes like the eyes of a man. I'll come back to him in a moment. We'll also refer to him as we go into chapter 8. But it's interesting. Remember what I said about throwing chronological order out the door as we go into these chapters. We're going to skip from a clear reference to the Antichrist and to those Gentile kingdoms that are now predicted and presented and projected as vicious, wicked, destructive beasts, to a vision of God. So there's a clear shift. It's abrupt. Let's look at verses 9 through 14, and you'll see what I mean. I watched till the thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from him before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. I watched. Then, because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, I watched till the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and a glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Now, okay, shift. Daniel has seen this vision. He has seen these kingdoms represented by these ferocious animals. He doesn't pay just a whole lot of attention to Babylon, Medo-Persia, even Greece. But we're going to see as we complete this chapter, he is very interested in that fourth kingdom. Here, beginning in verse 9, we see God. We don't just see some image of God. We see God clearly represented in power and glory, in holiness. Notice what it said, his garments were white as snow, and that his hair was like pure wool. So we see his majesty. But hear me, we see his justice too. Did you catch the references to fire? That fire was kind of emanating from him, from his throne. So clearly we see that fiery judgment comes from God's throne. It's not very long after that we see references to these kingdoms having been put down, and these thrones and these kings having been put aside, remembered by history, but not an eternal kingdom at all. Now, quickly in verse 11, after we see this image of God's throne, we get another reference to this little horn who was pompous and who had all of these fancy words to say, who was eloquent in his speech, but can't deliver what he promises, and that he's destroyed. Now, what does this tell us from the very beginning? That there is going to be one who is anti-God, who raises himself up to power instead of Christ, demonically empowered, but not able to deliver. At best, he is a pseudonym. He is a fake copy. He is not the real Christ. He's the anti instead of Christ. And we know what's going to happen to him. He's going to be destroyed. The Battle of Armageddon is going to be his demise, and he's going to be cast into the lake of fire, which is a forever sentence. And so we see what happens to the Antichrist, what has and will continue to happen to earthly Gentile kingdoms who are at best temporary rulers and whose kingdoms are at best a temporary kingdom. Now, beginning in verse 13, Daniel sees one like the Son of Man. Now, students of the New Testament are going to recall that one of the favorite ways that Jesus referred to himself was the Son of Man. Clearly, Daniel sees this image. Now, we may not have been totally sure of the identity of the fourth man in the fire. We may know that God sent an angel to Daniel in the lion's den, but this, there is no doubt. There is a clear reference to Jesus Christ, and he is in power and glory. Notice it said he was coming with clouds of heaven. No doubt those are glory clouds, like the ones that settled in when Solomon dedicated the temple, a little bit reminiscent of the cloud and the fire that led the children of Israel. And so here he comes, and he comes to the Ancient of Days. Now, this is just one way to refer to God, the one who is the ultimate judge of the whole earth, recognized through Scripture and called by numerous different titles. But Jesus is brought before the Ancient of Days, the God of all glory, and to him is given dominion. Notice that in verse 14, not just dominion, but glory. And what kind of kingdom? The kingdom where the whole earth and all of its peoples are going to serve him. Peoples from every tribe, every nation, every kindred, and every tongue. And then we're told that his dominion is what kind? Everlasting. So it's interesting, in 14 verses, God shows Daniel elevations of kingdoms of this earth for a short period of time. One who would dare to exalt himself against God and claim to be Christ. an image of God himself on the throne. What's going to happen and has happened to kingdoms of this world and their wicked rulers. What has definitely been prophetically predicted to happen to the Antichrist and will. And then what's going to happen to Jesus Christ. Just as the book of Colossians tells us, everything's been created for him, by him, everything is held together, and one day he will rule and reign over everything. Now, beginning in verse 15, we've talked about what some of these things mean as we work through, but Daniel didn't have that benefit. We not only have everything that Scripture is telling us, but we have proof because history has already proven that a good majority of that has already happened. Daniel is looking at it without that level of understanding. Now, remember, Belshazzar's still on the throne. Daniel's about 70 years old. Verse 15, and continuing our reading through the rest of the chapter. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Those great beasts, which are four kings which arise out of the earth. Now, there was a reference at the beginning of this chapter to the Great Sea. Could literally be the Mediterranean, could also be the fact that the sea seems to represent Gentile peoples and nations of the earth. And so when you see those references in Scripture, then prophetically you can pretty much conclude that. It doesn't conflict here with a reference to the earth, because again, we're talking about the earth and its peoples. But the saints of the Most High, verse 18, shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast. See that focus? Which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet, and the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which the 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes, and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Okay. Daniel is disturbed by what he's seen. He needs to understand what it means in verse 15. And in verse 16, he asks someone, help me. Now, we're going to see that Daniel shows up to help him interpret things he's seen. There are different interventions so that Daniel receives the information that he needs. This is a little different. Now, when it says, I ask someone who's standing nearby, I think that there is good evidence from Scripture. Daniel has just before verse 15 seen the throne room of God, seen scores of people before the throne, seen a huge host who minister to God, And so we assume he's asking someone that's nearby there to help him, someone who already has knowledge and understanding. There's no name given. I don't think we need one. Divine revelation is about to occur in the verses that I just read for you here, so we don't have to question that. He has asked someone who was in God's presence in that image that he has just seen. So he says, tell me the truth. Tell me what's going on. Tell me what happens about these four kings. Now, when we started chapter 7, I want you to understand, again, we're focusing on what happens to Israel. What is going to happen to God's people? How are they going to be impacted? So we see this progression of kingdoms, but remember what I said about the fourth one. This is not just legs of iron here. It's this whole what happens after Greece? What happens when the Roman Empire someday is going to become the revised Roman Empire under the Antichrist? So we're getting a very expanded look with focus on, okay, in the short term future, Babylon's going to go down, Medo-Persia is going to come, then Greece. I do need to tell you that chapter 7 is one of the reasons that people who are unbelievers, who doubt prophecy, attack this book. You remember that there's a 200-year period when the Medo-Persian Empire is ruling, and Daniel's dead. And so then you have Greece come. Because there is so much detail and the time frame, the time lapse that's there, people argue, well, this had to have been recorded after the life of Daniel. He couldn't have written this. There's too much detail. They are basically discounting our God, who has the power to reveal to his prophets what is going to occur. So let me assure you that Daniel wrote this. Now, he didn't write it down when he was 70. We have reason to believe that. But he wrote it down before his life ended, and it just proves the detail and accuracy of what God predicts using his prophets as his mouthpiece. Now, he wants to know about the fourth beast in verse 19. It's different. It's strong. And he wants to know, no doubt, about this little horn. And this little horn, we're told, makes war against the saints. Now, again, Daniel's concern about his people, chapter 7's focus on what's going to happen to the Jews. No doubt this is what's going to happen to the Jews, and also tribulation saints who did not have an adequate witness, who have not rejected Messiah and have not accepted the mark of the beast by this time. Because this time period, no doubt, is probably the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, when the Antichrist steps up his attacks, steps up his rigid stipulations, demanding that he be worshipped, demanding that people take the mark of the beast. You know, Pastor's been teaching this, so I know you're very aware of all that. Now we're told not only is he full of pompous words, but he looks different from the average run-of-the-mill man. We know that he is going to be a powerful presence. He's going to be a charismatic personality. But it's not because he's anointed by God, and it's not because he's God's chosen. So we're told here that the 10 horns are 10 kings. We are told that the Antichrist is going to pluck them up. Some believe that 3 of those kingdom areas are just going to basically hand themselves over to him. Some believe that he's going to take them by power and force. It doesn't really matter what you believe about that. He's going to very quickly have control of 3 areas of what used to be the Roman Empire. And he's going to persecute, he's going to attack, he's going to make life difficult. At the end of verse 25, we're told you for a time, times, and half a time, which would be a year, 2 years, and another half a year, or the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. Verses 26 and 27 encourage us, despite the content of the early portions of that chapter. Because see, the dominion of all Gentile rulers is ultimately going to be taken away. And the Antichrist is simply going to be the last of a string of those. A Gentile person who is not going to be the Messiah. And one day Messiah will rule and reign from Jerusalem, and there will be no other. And the greatness of all of the kingdoms of this earth are going to pass away. And notice it says that kingdom greatness and authority are going to be given to the people of the Most High God. I need to remind you that this world is not all there is. And when we are out of here one day, we're going to come back with the one who is the ultimate ruler of the earth. And we will rule and reign with him for 1,000 years during the millennium. And then one day in the new Jerusalem and the new heavens and new earth. Okay. This ends basically Daniel's first vision. It hops and skips around in time a little bit. He's disturbed by what he sees, but he does not talk about it. This reminds me of the phrase that Mary kept these things and pondered them in her heart. So he's troubled and he's concerned, but he's keeping those matters to himself. And then we go into chapter 8. And as we go into chapter 8, I'm going to remind you that here we're doing even more skipping around in time. And I think you'll see that. Now, let me read maybe the first 8 verses again. Daniel 8, in the 3rd year, verse 1 of the reign of King Belshazzar. So what do we know immediately? It was what year of Belshazzar in chapter 7? Did you pick up on that? It was the 1st year of his reign. So now a couple of years have passed. So we're guessing Daniel is 72-ish in that area, and he's had another vision. So instead of moving from court event to court event, as we did in the first half of this book, we're now moving into the different visions. And the second half of the book of Daniel focuses primarily on 4 visions, Daniel's prayer life, and how God's going to use that. All right. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram, which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, and one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no other that could deliver the ram from his hand. Wow. Okay, now, it is very clear here that, again, Daniel is seeing a vision. There are animals representing Gentile kingdoms, and even more than chapter 7, we're going to see a focus on what's going to happen to the Jews in the immediate future. There's a small element of that in 7, but in chapter 8, it is predominant. So not too much mention of Babylon. Again, Babylon is on its way out. If the first vision was about 10 years before Babylon fell, we're now about 8 years before the fall of Babylon. And we see here the 2 that I've just read short portions about. We've got a ram and we've got a goat. Now, the ram has 2 horns. This is very likely, again, Medo-Persia. The two horns are eventually going to be taken out. As we understand, they were high, but then they're not, because they're going to be attacked by a goat. Now, there's a lot of repetition here, so I don't mean to belabor and to bore you with that. The ram is standing, and notice where it is. It's by the river Ulai. Now, I need to go back and make sure that you picked up Daniel's in Babylon when he has this vision, but he sees himself as where? Shushan. Now, why is that significant? It's very important, in fact, because Shushan appears in the Bible again later. In fact, we picked that up in the book of Esther. We've mentioned that before because it became the kind of center of Medo-Persian power. So even though Daniel is physically in Babylon, in the vision he is translated about 232 miles to a totally different place. And so he sees this ram by this river, and it has these two horns, and one is higher. Okay, they're both high, but one is higher, and that's, of course, the Persian dominance. And then he sees that the ram is pushing, it is conquering, it is doing its thing, and it becomes great. And then here comes the goat. Now, what do we know about this goat? I'm not sure that you're aware of the fact that Greece is surrounded by the Aegean Sea. Did you know that Aegean means goat? So Greece is literally surrounded by the Goat Sea, and that one of the first established cities in Greece, there was the so-called supernatural suggestion that they allow a goat to help them decide where it's built. So there is an association between Greece and goats. If you're interested in that, there's a lot of information out there. You can go back and get it and read about that. So the goat tramples the ram. And you see again the transition of power. Go back and join me in verse 8. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. And in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. Let me stop right here. You remember in chapter 7, there was the description of the beast that's very strong, and there are references to iron and metals, and there are 10 horns, and then there's a little horn. And I told you that little horn is the Antichrist. Now I've got a ram that is replaced by a goat, and the goat has a significant horn, and that horn is broken off. Now clearly that horn is Alexander the Great. The 4 little horns that come up after him are those 4 generals. But then there's this other little horn. And notice what it says. He gets to be really great toward the south, the east, and toward the glorious land. Now, this language is not exactly like what we saw in chapter 7, and I told you that it's a clear reference to the Antichrist. We're about to get a little muddy here, not too bad. This chapter focuses again on the more imminent is a good word, future for the Jews. Most Bible scholars believe that the verses I'm about to read to you refer to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Now, hear me. He is a Seleucid king of Syria. Do you remember when I told you when we were looking in chapter 7 that the territories were divided and there was a Seleucid ruler over Syria, and I said I would come back to that? Who on earth is Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, first of all, that wasn't his name. He took that name when he ascended the throne after his father's death. And he added Epiphanes himself because he basically viewed himself as godlike, and it basically means God manifest. But as kind of a play on words, he was also known as Antiochus Epimanes, which means the mad. He had a vendetta against the Holy Land, and he did conquer Jerusalem. And he was a madman, and he desecrated the temple, erected a statue of Zeus in the temple of the most holy God. Not only that, when he defamed the altar of God by sacrificing a pig on it, the temple was unusable for a long period of time. And so if you're looking at the near history or the closer things that were going to happen to Israel, it makes sense. I need to remind you, Genesis 1 talks about all of creation. Genesis 2 comes back and looks at the creation of Adam and Eve in more detail. Chapter 7 is a broader scope. Chapter 8 is a little more zoomed in. Now, Antiochus was a type of the Antichrist. Let me give you an example. Kind of like Joseph was a type of Jesus Christ. Joseph, the Bible tells us, was sent ahead into Egypt so that he might bring about the salvation of his family, of his people. The same way that Jesus came into the world to bring about our salvation. So types are a very common device in the Old Testament to help us understand something that was going to happen. So here's where it's confusing. The behavior of Antiochus Epiphanes is so like the behavior of the Antichrist, you can argue when you talk about one, you talk about the other. But notice here, he clearly comes out of the Syrian division of the Grecian Empire that was divided into four parts. Go back with me to verse 9. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly toward the south, toward the east, and toward the what? The glorious land. Now, when you see that, that's a reference to Israel. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down because of transgression. An army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now, very likely, that's a little confusing. It probably refers to morning and evening sacrifices, which would be half of 2,300, or about 3 years and 2 months, give or take. All right, now, obviously, when Daniel sees this, he is confused. He's like, okay, I just had this vision a couple of years ago about these animals. This one's different. The animals are different. I need to understand. So very quickly, he goes into a request. And I've said it many times. If we need any indication of God's favor of this man, in the next few chapters, we're going to see it in multiple fashions. So join me, verse 15. Then it happened, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai. Now again, remember, he saw the start of the ram standing by the banks of that river, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So I'm not even going to argue about the man who instructs. I'm going to go straight to the fact that Gabriel is going to give Daniel dictation, literally, so he will understand what he's just seen. Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and stood me upright, and he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king, that's Alexander. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. Listen to the detail. Remember what I said about Daniel being attacked because of the amount of detail. And in the latter time of their kingdom, notice what that just said. In the latter time of that Grecian kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even arise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days afterward. I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. Now, when you look at those last few verses I read, clearly, if you study the life of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, his father was the third, they could describe him. Someone will point out, well, what about that part that says that he won't be killed by human means? Well, Antiochus didn't die in battle and nobody poisoned him. You might say that God just took him out. So you can't argue that it doesn't apply to him. Do those things also apply to the Antichrist? Absolutely. Remember, Antiochus is clearly a type of the Antichrist. So what do we know? The Jews were not allowed to keep normal worship, feasts, and holidays. The sacrifices for morning and evening were taken away. That temple was destroyed, really. It was defamed. It was polluted. There were no sacrifices there. Now, again, if you like history, Judah Maccabees. The Maccabees lived in the gap between the Old and the New Testament. There are 2 books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They are not part of the canon of Scripture for some reasons, but historically they have value. And they tell the story of this priestly family who were, that the members were defiant against those who overran Jerusalem, who defamed the temple, who destroyed the right to sacrifice because of the sacrilege that took place there. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of reading out there for that as well. But we clearly see here that whether you think this totally refers to Antiochus, whether you think it refers to the Antichrist, or whether you're a believer that it's kind of a merge of both, the destruction, the intent to take down all that's holy, the association with occultic and demonic aspects, the fact that he's going to be taken down and God's going to be the one to do it, those images are clearly represented here. Judas Maccabeus recaptured Jerusalem, reconstructed the temple, and purified the altar in about 165 BC. So still more than 150 years before Jesus Christ, we see that that battle occurred to bring back the right to reinstitute the sacrifices. If you've been listening to Pastor Bell's teachings that he posts on Wednesday nights, you already know that there is another who's going to be interested in the very same thing that's coming in the future. Now, after Daniel sees all of this, it's heavy. And he basically is zapped. He is sick and unable to take care of his duties. And people are like, well, why would a vision from God leave him like that? Remember, Pastor teaches us often that in this physical state, in this physical body, we are not designed to handle a high level of God's glory. He has just encountered not only the man who instructs, and I'm going to use the term man loosely, who tells Daniel, look, Gabriel, go over there and explain everything Daniel needs to know. And even earlier, as he's in Gabriel's presence, you see that he's already on his face and needs a restoration of strength. So he's been exposed to a high level of divine revelation and a high level of heavenly presence. And so we find he's left in a weakened state. I don't know if you would say that. I don't think he had a virus or something like that. I don't think COVID-19 was a problem, but I think that he had just responded in this physical body to a heavy dose of God's revelation power. And so it left him in that state. Now, when we come back together next week, we're going into chapter 9. If you get a chance, read it before then. I have never in Scripture seen a better example of an intercessor and how we need those today. God bless you. Be encouraged, because remember, those who exalt themselves against God will one day be put down, and we win. God bless you.